Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This is a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, and always with the underlying question of how do we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship. Today's episode is exploring spontaneous mystical experiences or spontaneous mystical awakenings, kundalini awakenings, and on the more negative side, what you might call a spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency. These are experiences that are not necessarily elicited by psychedelics, but are arising out of I guess you'll hear in the interview as we talk about it. Like all episodes, I'm going to start this one off with an overture. This one's a little bit more lengthy than I normally have, so bear with me, and you're free to read along in the show notes of this episode at jameswjesso.com. Here we go. It is well established at this point that psychedelics can occasion mystical type experiences. However, what is less studied and less understood, at least insofar as the modern Western world, are spontaneous mystical experiences, so-called spontaneous mystical awakenings that have no direct catalyst. Certainly, that such experiences happen is hard to argue. Even the physicalists and materialists of the world would have a hard time saying that mystical type experiences don't exist. Irrespective of the freestanding reality of the content of those experiences or the degree to which they are true or reflective of some kind of truth, those experiences are had by many people and all throughout history. The very foundations of civilization as we know it, for better or for worse, are in humanity's stories of the mystery and the mystical experienced. What complicates matters, though, is that in the modern world, we have different terms and responses to spontaneous mystical experiences than our ancestors did. The terms we have are psychosis, schizophrenic episode, and mania. We have responses like drug them down and or lock them up. Now, this isn't to say that conditions like psychosis, schizophrenia, or bipolar don't exist, or that they don't cause harm, or that they don't warrant medication or hospitalization in certain circumstances. What I'm speaking to here is that we lack the capacity to tease out the nuances between things like a schizophrenic episode and a spontaneous mystical experience. And thus we lack the capacity to know how to properly support people in those experiences or episodes. Be they kundalini awakenings, manic episodes, spiritual emergencies, transient psychosis, near-death experiences, all we have is biological psychiatry and naturalism, which is the world exists only of what is external and can be measured by science. So all we have is biological psychiatry and naturalism informing how we respond to people besought by things far beyond what their baseline mind, what anyone's baseline mind can handle, and the consequences that follow. Different experiences in different contexts, happening in different brains, have different consequences and need different approaches. And when all you have is a hammer, yada, yada, yada. However, and although it can be a fine line, there is a growing recognition that of there being a difference between a transient psychotic episode and a spontaneous mystical experience, wherein the latter is getting an increasingly nuanced eye for both our capacity to understand what is happening for people, but also a context-sensitive management of their experiences in ways that don't pathologize a spiritual experience or spiritualize a psychopathology. Our ability to develop this nuanced thinking and approach is emerging from researchers taking a compassionate, discerning, and open-minded look at these experiences. The guest for this episode of the podcast is one of those researchers, and she is on the show to talk about her findings. Jessica Corneille is a research psychologist specializing in spontaneous spiritual awakening experiences. Her main reason in life is to challenge the default pathologization of awakening experiences by helping to inform and encourage mainstream psychology to look beyond the current designated spectrum of, quote, normality, to encompass the transpersonal as something that is intrinsic to the human experience. Jessica has presented her work at a number of academic conferences, including with the British Psychological Society. She also works for the Scientific and Medical Network, is a member of the Galileo Commission Steering Committee, and a collaborator of the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium and Spiritual Crisis Network. Jessica is also dedicated to helping individuals come to the realization of their highest human potential and fulfills part of this mission as a Kundalini yoga teacher, contracted leadership and empowerment facilitator, and by running regular peer support groups for individuals undergoing spiritual transformation. On this episode of the podcast, we start by presenting a definition of a mystical type of experience or spontaneous mystical awakening before going on to explore the after effects of spontaneous mystical experiences, how these experiences seem to affect both atheists and strongly religious folk differently, common preceding factors, the neurobiological and psychological factors correlated with spontaneous mystical experiences, as well as negative mystical experiences, such as spiritual crisis or spiritual emergencies. We also deconstruct the exclusive pathologizing of psychosis, bipolar, and schizophrenia, and the delegitimization of the mystical states of other cultures as a kind of colonialist prejudice or racism. And we end with a discussion on integrating spontaneous awakening experiences and how to support people in their integration of those spontaneous mystical awakenings or experiences. So that's what you're getting into for this episode. A couple of notes. Number one, I'm not at my best in this interview. This was still in the midst of the pretty heavy into the concussion phase. I think I showed up pretty well given where I was at, but every podcast just wrecked me, sometimes for days afterwards. But anyways, I'm not entirely at my best in this one. The other bit is that due to some complications beyond my control, there was a lot of things that needed to be clipped, like a lot of hard cut edits that needed to be done. So you might notice, if you're a listener of the show, you know that I really pride myself on giving you the whole interview, giving you the sort of the whole living body of the thing that was the conversation, the artifact of two minds meeting. And this is going to feel like a slight deviation from that due to these complications I didn't foresee. Ultimately, you might not even notice, so disregard that if you didn't. But that is 2 points that you would want to hang on when listening. Of course, this podcast is brought to you by people like yourself, my patrons on Patreon and the other people who voluntarily offer financial support to the workload of this podcast. Doing this work is my full-time job, and I absolutely love that I can put my full-time hours into something that I care so much about and something that feels, at least hopefully, is having good onto the world, and a thing that is ultimately sort of in the arts independent journalism space, and there's nobody paying me a check every week to get it done. And through the generosity of folks who enjoy and find value in the content I produce, I can earn a living. And that's really meaningful and important for me, and I really appreciate it. So big thanks to my patrons on Patreon, especially the people listed on the screen here on YouTube, or in the description of this episode, wherever you're checking it out. Those people give significantly, some of which for quite a long time. And if you're not yet a patron, please do become one. You could head to patreon.com/James W. Jesso, linked in the description here, or other links to one-time donations, also much appreciated. And if you can't donate right now, that's okay. Enjoy this content. Hopefully you find value in it. Others are stepping in with the resources that they have to compensate for those of us who do not have those extra resources, especially these times are pretty complicated for financial resources. So that all said, this is episode 171 of Adventures Through the Mind, Spontaneous Mystical Experiences, Qualities, Causes, and Consequences, with Jessica Corneille. Enjoy. Jessica Corneille, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
So we actually got connected by a mutual colleague, Sam Gandy. I don't know your relationship with him, but I know that I hold him in high regards, and he just messaged me out of the blue and said, hey, I think you should check out this person's work. I think it would really fit for your show. And I checked it out and I was like, oh, this does really fit. And I'm excited to have you. And I really appreciate that. Yeah, you've made the time to come onto the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much. Well, it's really great to be here. And I know of your podcast, and I know that it's held in high regards for many people as well. So it's great to be here.
Oh, cool. Well, let's just jump right in, because your research presently is about spontaneous spiritual awakenings. And this isn't a question about your personal story, but what I understand about your personal story is that it was your own spontaneous spiritual awakening that sort of shifted your priorities and sent you into the field of researching this. And that might come up in the podcast, but maybe just like to lay the ground for us, why don't you tell us what is a spontaneous spiritual awakening? Like, what do you mean by spontaneous spiritual awakening?
Yeah. Okay, cool. So a spontaneous spiritual awakening is a subjective experience of direct contact, communion, or union, or i.e. the experience of oneness with a cosmic consciousness, universal consciousness, God. Some people might interpret it as God, or the divine. So it's this non-intentional, kind of random experience and sudden experience of this oneness or connection with something, I want to say other than ourselves, but it's actually very much an experience of a connection with our deep inner core nature as well. So yeah, but these experiences are really ineffable as well. So it's really hard to pinpoint or create a certain definition around this kind of experience. But that is the common thread that runs through all of these kinds of experiences, is that oneness or that connection and that love, that undying, unlimited, incredible sense of love for more.
So that's such a beautiful description. What kind of qualities or attributes? Because I imagine it's not just like it's ineffable. It's this giant experience. It's probably not like something that you can fully describe in every nuanced detail that's the same for everybody with a single sentence. There must be some overlapping and sort of mix of qualities and attributes that people will experience. So what are some of the qualities and attributes that you've found to be present in spontaneous spiritual awakenings?
Yeah. So just in repetition of what I've just said, so connection with everything and everyone, a sense that there's more, a sense of limitless love, feelings of gratitude often show up as one of the most prominent features of the experience, feelings of empathy and of acceptance and of peace and of presence and of bliss. And we'll go on to the sort of more difficult spiritual awakening experiences later on, because I think it's important for us to touch on those too. But typically speaking, the experience of non-duality or awakening or enlightenment, as some people might refer to the experiences, but for that kind of experience, these are the common features that, or like a golden thread that ties all these experiences together. But the experience can also be more sort of like cognitively shifting. So it can make people feel like they're receiving downloads, or they have like this endless stream of thoughts coming into their minds, or intellectual. Some people feel that their intellectual abilities drastically increase post this kind of experience. I know for sure that that's how I felt. Whether it's true or not, I'm not sure. But I definitely felt that I gained this new sense of understanding and of ability to understand the world around me in a way that I hadn't experienced before. And then for some people, the experience is more physical as well. So some people report feeling senses of electrical, like electricity, or kind of like fireworks in the extremities. So in the hands and the feet, typically, or in the third eye, in the point between the eyebrows, sensations of heat or of light emanating or shooting through the body. So typically reported, particularly in what is referred to as a Kundalini awakening, is a sense of heat, or this kind of embodiment of flames just rising up from the base of the spine all the way up to the crown of the head. and feelings of auric luminosity. So it's not so much a visual experience of seeing lights coming out of the body, but it's a sense. It's like gaining an extra sense. So it's very difficult to put into words again, but it's a sense of light emanating from certain centers in the body. So again, for me, I had this sense that there was light emanating from my heart space and from my third eye point and the crown of my head. And, these are things that I wasn't exposed to. I wasn't exposed to esoteric or spiritual texts or literature before my experience. In fact, I was very much against anything pertaining to the spiritual. I would laugh at it. So it was very interesting to have that experience. And then for some people, the experience is slightly more paranormal, and people often actually report an increase in synchronicities or coincidences post the experience. And also people often report senses of telepathy or kind of being able to tap into other people's thoughts. But I believe, this is my own, again, subjective interpretation of it, is that we gain a sensitivity, generally speaking. So sensitivity to lights, to colors, to shines, to touch, to smell. So the senses are so heightened that I think we just become more aware and more able to tap in and be empathetic towards other people. So yeah, again, my own personal interpretation of all of this is that it's not anything beyond our typical ability as human beings, but it's almost like a door opens and we're able to experience the full spectrum of human experience, which is so vast. And we're often so closed off to it in our normal waking existence, because we are, we live more in the sort of survival mode, generally speaking. So yeah, I know you didn't ask me for my interpretation, but I felt the need to sort of express that as well, because it's something that's been on my mind a lot. Yeah.
Your interpretation as in the sort of like expansiveness of the senses and the sort of like opening a perceptual connection with what's already there, but normally is shut down due to, we could get into this later, but due to the sort of like socio-cultural context that all of us are born and raised within, being very much a self-protected kind of like, like what was the term you used? I think, did you use protection as a word, like closed?
Like a sort of, it's like a valve is closed and then something opens, or a door opens. I don't know if that's what you were referring to, but it very much, I feel, feels that way.
Mm-hmm. I think you had said something like, but normally we're closed off to it. But anyways, conversations about how it is that our sociocultural contexts tend to limit our ability to access these things and negatively impact our ability to make sense of them afterwards, we can maybe save for later. I have a couple more questions about the sort of like the phenomenology of the experience. You had mentioned changes in feelings and thought patterns and experience. I'm wondering, what do you have in the sense of like visual or auditory changes in visual auditory processing? Could be hallucinations or could be described as hallucinations, both during the experience and afterwards. Like, have you found both people were hearing things and seeing things, and then later they see and hear differently, or anything like that?
Quite rarely reported, but still reported, are experiences of hearing or seeing things that are not typically, or they're not produced outside of the sort of inner context or mind. So that has been reported, but it's not really a very common feature of these experiences, actually, kind of seeing or hearing things, or what are typically reported as hallucinations. More an increase in sensitivity, and a newfound way of existing and of understanding ourselves and the world around us. That's more typical. But yes, the hallucinations do occur, and I don't like to call them that, because it kind of narrows down the experience to something that, I don't know. We don't know what truly exists, right? In this beautiful world of ours, we don't know. Like, we have so many limitations to our minds. So I don't like to put my own interpretation onto those kinds of experiences. But yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel that last comment there is likely why there's at least in the psychedelic and spiritual culture, there's this sort of like, I think, conscientious shift from using the term hallucination to using the term vision, because it doesn't have that kind of baggage of not being real. It doesn't necessarily claim that it's real or not real, but it doesn't kind of imply that by default it isn't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Totally true. Yeah.
So just because my short-term memory struggles, you were talking about paranormal. And so with respect to visions, do people report as a part of their spiritual awakening, spontaneous spiritual awakenings, any encounter with different entities in the paranormal, say angels? I mean, we talk about the harder side of it too, maybe demons, but that could say for later. But like angels or entities, and in particular, not only just in the acute experience, but continuing on afterwards.
Mm-hmm. In terms of my own research, not very many reported entities, but yes, I mean, in terms of what we know about spiritual awakenings or these kinds of states, is that people do tend to or might encounter certain non-human entities during their experience. In my own research, though, I did communicate to, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 people who had an experience of a visionary experience of being in contact with entities. And there was one that really, really stood out because I've read this in near-death accounts and also I think in DMT experience accounts. But this woman that I interviewed, she reported seeing, and again, this was completely spontaneous. She had never taken psychedelics before. She didn't know anything about spirituality before, and this experience converted her. She experienced seeing blue beings all of a sudden. So she was reading like Eckhart Tolle randomly one day. She came across it, read an article of his, and had this experience of like, first of all, she saw herself from another angle. And then she said that she experienced seeing these blue beings kind of looking down on her, these blue genderless beings, and sort of like, kind of like investigating, like questioning why she was there or why she had come so far. So that's one of the accounts that I personally encountered with one of the participants from my study. And then another had an experience of an encounter with a snake. So, and this was during a more physical, what is typically referred to as a Kundalini awakening. But again, I think these definitions are really vague and maybe it's best not to use them. But yeah, he had a very physical experience of light and heat shooting up from the base of the spine to the crown of the head. And then he said that when the light hit his third eye and crown, he just had this vision of the snake. But more commonly reported, and this doesn't really pertain to the entity side of it, but in terms of visions, actually what's pretty commonly reported are sacred geometric shapes with the eyes open or closed, or fractal type visions. So that's something that is more commonly reported.
Interesting. Fractal type visions. I'm going to ask you a little bit later about DMT, because that is related to your research in some respects, in a comparative respects. But first, I think something that warrants some clarification is, at least maybe in my mind, was spontaneous spiritual awakenings. Like, oh, cool. So like it just happened out of nowhere. And that might be the case, but your research has identified that sometimes there's no apparent trigger, but usually there's a series of things that are happening that are, can be associated as being triggers to this spontaneous awakening. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So in my study, we specifically looked at people who had the experience randomly and non-intentionally. And that was part of the research, part of the question to recruit participants. So we were very explicit regarding that. So we sort of had to kind of ask people who had the experience under the influence of psychedelics or other type of kind of mind-altering substances to not respond to the questionnaire and so on. But there were preceding factors. So for instance, commonly reported of a preceding factor is experience of being out in nature, or being already in close contact with nature before the experience. Also commonly reported preceding factors are spiritual contemplative practices practiced over a certain amount of time before the experience. But what is really interesting, and what other research papers and publications have indicated, is that psychological turmoil and periods of intense trauma can actually be, they seem to be the most commonly reported preceding factors to a spontaneous awakening experience. So that was, it's really fascinating. Actually, it's perhaps not that intuitive, and yet several papers have now indicated this, including my own. And I think it warrants more investigation for sure.
So what's your read on that at this point? Like, not necessarily what your research has proven or shown, but what is your sort of like, when that data comes up, when that's sort of like, oh, this is happening, how are you interpreting it at this point as to why that would be the case?
Perhaps in a not so scientific way, but I feel that there is a sort of dissolution of the ego. So when undergoing traumatic states, like even things like breaking up with somebody that you've been with for many, many years, your sense of identity shifts. And I think it's that adaptation to the shift that might open up space open up space for a new kind of egoic sense of self to emerge. Again, this is non-scientific. This is just interpretation. But I feel strongly that, that's the reason why trauma and turmoil can perhaps have such a profound effect on individuals, and might actually push people towards better kind of ways of, or more wholesome ways of existing, actually, which again is counterintuitive, but seems to be the case.
And probably not the rule of the norm as well, because I imagine a lot of people go through a lot of trauma, and only a small subset of them have mystical or spontaneous spiritual awakenings afterwards.
Exactly. It's more that if we look at it in the opposite, in the inverse, we see that a large amount of people who report having had spontaneous spiritual awakenings report having experienced psychological turmoil beforehand. So yes, but.
So what are the after effects of this? You reported not only, that people are having these spontaneous awakenings, and that there seems to be preceding factors and so on and so forth. You also sort of tracked what tends to be the consequence on the people having these experiences. And what did you find in that part of your research?
Yeah, in terms of consequences. So whether the experience is short or long term in its sort of peak, in the peak of the experience, so in the altered state of the experience almost always seems to have long-lasting effects. And that includes an increase of pro-social behaviors. So people report feeling more empathetic, more connected to humans, to animals, and just more able to relate to people and to forgive. There's an increase in pro-environmental behaviors as well. So again, often reported as this like increased connection towards nature, and thus there's like a heightened sense of responsibility to protect nature as well. And as a consequence of that, people tend to change their diets. Again, this is kind of grosso modo. It's not really, I don't have statistics for this, but in terms of anecdotal accounts, and also according to my own research, people do move towards more pro-environmental and pro-social behaviors, which then enable them to take up the behaviors or change the behaviors to becoming more attuned to that newfound kind of respect towards nature or other human beings. People also report feeling less materialistic after the experience. And also there tends to be a change in spiritual or religious beliefs or philosophical beliefs after the experience, which kind of makes sense because for most people, the experience of awakening is the most profound experience that they've ever sort of encountered. So that will obviously have cause a shift in the way that people think. But what's really interesting is that people who report feeling religious before the experience often report being non-religious but spiritual after the experience. And the same goes for, dogmatic atheism. People who are atheists before tend to report being spiritual but not religious after the experience. So again, there's this kind of newfound understanding or openness towards spirituality and towards different spiritual contexts after the experience. And what else? I mean, there are so many shifts that take place after the experience, but I think those are the most prominent ones.
Yeah, and even you had previously mentioned that before your spontaneous spiritual awakening, I think you said that you would laugh at spiritual concepts or something, or scoff at them. And in a previous recording I watched of you, you had mentioned being an atheist, and did you have that kind of shift as well?
Yeah, definitely. So I'd always been really interested in in astronomy and in the cosmos, and I'd always asked myself really big questions from a very young age. So in many ways, I was already spiritual, but I didn't know it, because I think contemplation is at the core of spirituality. But yeah, I always was totally rejectant of anything pertaining to kind of spiritual beliefs or esoteric beliefs or any of that kind of stuff. And I was certainly not interested in religion. I'm still not religious dogmatically, but I now understand religion, and I understand the root of all religions, the sort of beauty and the mysticism of religions. So I can sort of empathize with them and with people who believe in them a lot more now. But yeah, I certainly was an atheist, a proud atheist before the experience, and kind of prided myself on it a lot. And I remembered my mum telling me, because she's quite spiritual, again, in a more contemplative kind of sense. She doesn't kind of practice anything, but I remember her telling me when I was growing up, like, yeah, okay, you're atheist and you're proud of this, but just keep a little door open to spirituality. And I was like, yeah, whatever. And then eventually, yeah, this is what happened. And the doors flung wide open. So, yeah.
I'm recalling an anecdote, or like a kind of inquiry that comes out of an anecdote from somebody who I spent quite a bit of time reading and sort of trying to digest. His name's Stephen Jenkinson, and he used to do a lot of like in-home sort of counseling for dying people. And he was talking about atheism, and he was talking about the amount of atheists or people who were atheists who at the end of their life struggled quite a bit with that belief. And he says something, it's like everyone, like it's easy to be strong in the daytime when it feels really far away and all the rest. But in those midnight hours when it's just you and your pending, like non-existence, right? It's like, is it better? Like what he said something about like the question between like the being right your whole life and it is nothing and you go nowhere and this is the end. It is oblivion. It's less than nothing, like it's never have been, never been, or you were wrong your entire life. Right. So it's like, I don't know. I'm not making any claims. It just came to mind in that moment. That sort of that inquiry out of that anecdote.
Totally. Yeah, that's really beautiful. And actually something that I didn't mention earlier, or at least I don't think I mentioned, and it's very pertinent to what you're saying, is that or somewhat pertinent, actually, perhaps not fully, but it just sprung to mind, is that these experiences tend to make people less afraid of death as well. So yeah, but in quite a substantial way. And that's why mystical experiences mediated by psychedelics, for instance, have been shown to sort of reduce levels of anxiety in people with terminal illness. So yeah, a nice little tangent there off of what you said.
Mm-hmm. So let's shift into the negative. Let's go into the dark, because when I saw the sort of data from your work, you had found that there are some people who have negative spontaneous spiritual awakenings, a very, very small percentage, but they exist. And so I'd like to sort of ask, kind of get your phenomenological map that you have found of the negative experiences and those changes, sort of like the same course that we just went through, but like starting with the negative, and then I want to shift into a different series of questions. So what did you find with respect to what the negative experiences are like, both in their qualities and their attributes and whatever else, but also how they impact people afterwards?
Yeah, so in terms of the phenomenology and the subjective experience of more negative awakening experiences, people might report just not feeling comfortable with this kind of newfound way of operating. It can be extremely distressing. It can be really challenging, actually, particularly when you don't have a framework through which to understand the experience already. We don't have a context through which to kind of understand them, or a community with which to discuss them, which is why they're perhaps more likely to occur in cases of spontaneous awakenings. So they can be extremely challenging. They can have quite profound the physical effects can be quite profound with negative experiences as well. So disruptions in the digestive system and the reproductive system often occur. Sensations of burning that doesn't go away in the body, and new sort of challenging extrasensory perception. So perhaps, just relaying back to what you were saying about the visions or hallucinations or experiences of seeing things or hearing sounds that are not produced externally. That might be extremely, if one was to encounter that spontaneously, it might be extremely challenging. And so, yeah, those are some of the more negative experiences that might occur. But again, they seem to be less common with these kinds of experiences, but they do happen. And they're referred to as spiritual emergencies or crises. And whilst they're less common, I feel, than the more positive experiences, they are still quite commonly reported within the spiritual experience arena. So that definitely they warrant being discussed and talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's what, 20 billion people on the planet now? I'm just kidding, like seven or eight or something. When you have 7 or 8 billion people, even if it's only, whatever, 2%, that's still a lot of people that would be having spiritual awakenings. And if, another 2% of them are having negative ones, well, that's a lot of people having spiritual crisis, right? So despite the sort of like representative, like the statistical minority, there would still be probably quite a lot of people having these challenges, and of course, thus strongly warranting, a shift in, well, why is this negative for these people? How do we support people in this? You brought up spiritual emergency, spiritual crisis. I did this series called Psychedelic Cafes. And what it is a conversation cafe style, which is a type of structured conversation around a central question. And it's like a talking circle, but there's sort of guidelines for how you show up to each round of the talking. Like, first round, everyone shares one clear, coherent thought on the question. And then the second round is open discussion, and there are some guidelines for how we interact, so on and so forth. And it's always a conversation into the circle. It's never a conversation with one or another person. And I did one on spiritual crisis. What does it mean to have a spiritual crisis? And I included a number of people, including someone who had a spiritual crisis and different coaches. And actually the person before we got on this call, I was working on the final stuff to have her interview up on my website and live by the end of today, which is Anna Lakaitis, who wrote a whole book on the sort of adverse effects of meditation.
Yeah. We're both on the same research, part of the same research group, actually.
Oh, so that's great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, please go ahead.
No, your sharing circle sounds really, really great, and it's it's definitely something that's needed in today's world. But I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. It's funny because this will go on YouTube. So it's weird because it's like it brings this sort of hyper reality of recognizing that this is not just a conversation. This is a artifact that we're producing to be put into a larger sphere. But I'll leave a little card somewhere on YouTube here if anyone's watching on YouTube to link over to that conversation now. When I was researching your stuff, I was like, wow, I wonder if she knows Anna. I should find a way to get them both on a cafe or something. I wrote down like your two names and then like, what cafe is this going to be and who else is in it? So maybe that comes up one day.
Yeah, for sure. That'd be great. I don't think I've ever met her, but we are part of the same group. Yeah.
Cool. So I want to go back later. I want to go back into this sort of negative experience, but more so explore what is the context of our culture that makes it so that these experiences are so difficult to integrate, both how it informs people and how people's experiences are held afterwards. But let's just put a pin in that. I'd like to ask you a bit more about what your research found, or what you've come to know as you were sort of getting the basis of your research around how these spontaneous spiritual awakenings affects the brain, and vice versa, if there's anything that you learned about the brain that affects these spontaneous spiritual awakenings.
Yeah, so we weren't able to conduct, MRI or fMRI scans with the participants, and I think it would be quite a difficult research project, although it's something that I definitely want to do at some point soon. But it's just by the very nature of these experiences, i.e. them being spontaneous, it's very difficult to get a sort of before and an after. Yeah. But in terms of the sort of psychological factors or predictors of these experiences, what our research found actually is that traits such as trait absorption, which is the level and depth to which one becomes engrossed in something, but without any effort or control, that is positively correlated with the stronger spiritual awakening experience. And equally, another sort of thing that was really cool is that we found that temporal lobe lability, which is there's sort of the symptoms that arise with temporal lobe epilepsy. So stronger temporal lobe lability symptoms are also highly correlated with stronger spontaneous spiritual awakening experiences. So that we can't really deduct any sort of clear conclusion from that, but it is interesting. It is interesting to get to sort of a greater understanding of what might be a good predictor of the experience, i.e. those with higher levels or tendencies for engrossment without effort or control might be more likely or susceptible in the future to have a spontaneous awakening experience. Who knows to what extent? It's still a little indication, which is really cool. And then with temporal lobe lability, perhaps those who experience temporal lobe epilepsy are more susceptible to have these kinds of experiences. And vice versa, those who have these kinds of experiences might be more likely to experience temporal lobe epilepsy in the future, or have had temporal lobe epilepsy in the past. But again, we can't really come to any sort of conclusion regarding this because much more many more investigations need to be conducted with regards to this. But they were kind of cool little things that we found in the research.
Yeah, your comment there about the epilepsy is really interesting. I remember many years ago. I'm confident that I heard this many years ago. I don't know how legitimate it is now, but there being cultures somewhere, or a particular culture, where children born or people with epilepsy were, when they were having their seizures, they saw that as them having spiritual type experiences, and their seizures were not pathologized. They were sort of like, what's the word I'm looking for, when something is put on a religious pedestal. Yeah. Well, being put on a pedestal always comes sort of like with a weird tone, but like, yeah, that they're lionized. I don't know. Do you have much did that come up in your research, or do you have any understanding of that connection?
of the connection between spiritual experiences and temporal lobe epilepsy? Is that what?
Well, specifically, sort of cultural, different cultures or histories where, what in hindsight we could see is what's being described as this person's having an epileptic seizure, being associated culturally or historically as those people having spiritual type experiences or being more spiritual type beings.
Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly. I'm very fascinated by the topic, but off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you which specific cultures kind of interpret these experiences as more just, channeling or spiritual type experiences, as opposed to pathologizing them. But I know that, in many cultures, a varying number of what we call in the West psychopathologies or mental health disorders are actually considered blessings. They're considered experiences of grace in many cultures. And this is vague. And actually, a really good book that I'd like to recommend is Natalie Tolbert's book. I think it's called Cultural Interpretations of Spiritual Experiences.
I think I want to make a comment here, which is that while holding this conversation about these sort of like relationships between temporal lobe epilepsy and spiritual experience, etc., also recognizing that having epileptic seizures is a dangerous medical condition and people die. And so not to just like spiritualize the whole thing, also recognizing that it is and can be quite a serious condition, and people listening might have had people they know be seriously injured or died as a consequence of epileptic seizures, and not wanting to disregard that is also a thing, that it's not just this like magical gift that gives you spiritual perception. It can also result in somebody's death and in a tragic way that obviously would cause reverberations of a lot of pain into the people that knew them and loved them.
And that also I'm really glad that you kind of brought that up. I'd like to also bring that over to psychosis and schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, which, these experiences, I believe strongly that awakening experiences should be interpreted as experiences in their own right, as, profound experiences that have the potential to unlock innate human potential and allow people to live more wholesome and joyful lives. But there are definitely overlaps with mental health disorders, and it's really important to mention that, and that mental health disorders are also a thing. And whilst there are overlaps and interlinks, and we don't quite know how these experiences merge or how similar they are, how different they are, because not enough research has been conducted on spiritual awakening experiences. But, certainly we need to be aware that we're talking about, very extreme psycho-spiritual states. And sometimes people need, professional help, and they might even need medication for certain disorders, particularly if they're distressing. If they're not distressing, then that's for another conversation, and perhaps something that we shouldn't be debating right now. But yeah, exactly.
I was going to go there afterwards, but let's go there right now. And maybe this other question I had is relevant later, and maybe not. Because this is actually something that, as you can imagine, came up in my conversation with Anna Lakaitis around sort of pathologizing or psychopathologizing of spiritual experience. And there being this weird balance between, okay, so is this a spiritual experience, or is this somebody experiencing a psychotic episode, right? How do we track the difference in those things? Because they can seem very, very similar from the outside. And I remember, I know that in one of the DSMs, they introduced a new disorder called like religious or spiritual issues or something, to be like, hey, also, it isn't actually helpful to treat somebody who's having a spiritual experience as if they are having, the borderline personality disorder or like schizophrenia, or this person is suffering from classic depersonalization, because psychologizing that experience can actually do more harm than not. And simultaneously, this person could actually be going through a psychotic episode and needs like clinical intervention, perhaps even pharmaceutical intervention, to to minimize potentially large amounts of harm. And then there's this whole weird context where we don't know what's what, or, maybe. Okay, so here's the question then. Now that I comment on that as much as you
Try
like,
and answer it.
but the question is, when I listen to you talk about your experience, I think you had mentioned, the challenge of making sense of it afterwards. And when you spoke about the negative experiences, generally you had said like, oh, this person didn't have a context for the experience, and so it was scary and overwhelming, and or didn't have a context afterwards that made it so that they could actually digest this in their life. What is your sort of take on the sort of, when I say our culture, I sort of mean the sort of dominant Western culture that is literally dominating and overtaking the planet, this sort of like Western mind, which I don't have any particular problem with. It's just a particular thing. But no, I have a problem with the domination. I don't see there's anything fundamentally wrong with Western mindset or something. But what do you see about the culture that we're in, and why it is that the context of that culture leads to negative experiences both during and afterwards?
I think there's a real lack of understanding of these experiences, scientifically speaking and psychologically speaking. Like I said earlier, we don't know where the boundary, or if there even is a boundary between, lies between spiritual experiences and mental health disorders. But what the West has tended to do is to pathologize the experience by default, and that in itself is harmful towards people who have, any sort of spiritual experience, actually, because it already invalidates the experience, and that in itself can be extremely harmful to the experiencer, because not only might somebody find themselves without the context through which to understand the experience, not only might they not have a community through which to discuss the experience, but they also innately have, and subconscious, it's deeply embedded in our subconscious, that if we have anything that is that falls outside the boundaries of what we know to be normality, we'll consider ourselves insane by default. And that idea that we're insane can also be incredibly harmful, especially because it's not a given that if you have an experience that falls outside this boundary of what we know to be real or what we know to be true, it's not a given that that's not a better way of living than what falls within this bracket. I don't know if I'm making sense. It's making sense in my mind, but what I'm trying to say, and in summary, is that the pathologization of these experiences can be really, really harmful. And what we need is an increase in the science of, or an increased understanding of the science and the neurology and the neuroscience and the psychology of these experiences, in order to better inform individuals undergoing the experience, but also clinicians who are working with individuals having these kinds of extreme experiences, and informing them how to best handle the experience as well. Because I don't think that the medicalization of these experiences is fair as a first course of action. Evidently, if somebody needs more attention, then yes, certainly they can take medication for it, or even initially, whatever. It's up to each individual. I just think that clinicians and psychologists should have a better kind of first call of action to dealing with people who are undergoing extreme psychospiritual states, including spontaneous spiritual awakenings. I've spoken to a number of people who said that they had the most blissful unitive experience, so they didn't feel that they were going insane. And in fact, a common feature of these experiences, and obviously it's not the same for everybody, but a common feature is that the experience feels realer than real. So I've had conversations with people where they've expressed that they had this blissful, realer than real experience where they found themselves, this sense of inner peace, this sense of inner knowing, of connection, of empathy, of love. And they went to, that the experience was still overwhelming. So they went to their mental health provider or their clinician and they discussed their experience openly, and they were suddenly sort of prescribed medication for it. And I don't think that's the fairest way to go about these kinds of experiences. I think they need to be treated individually, first of all, because not all experiences are the same. Some are negative, some are positive. How can we support people undergoing both extremes, as well? I don't think there should be a one size fits all kind of way of dealing with these experiences. And I think that can be extremely harmful. Mm-hmm. And also the tabooness, just to conclude, the tabooness of these experiences. Not sure if that's even a word, tabooness, but yeah, the fact that these experiences are so tabooed make it so difficult for people to come out of their spiritual closet as well. And so, again, that withholding of information and that holding it in, when for many people, it's the most blissful and incredible, or even non-blissful, even most terrifying, but it's an experience that is so strong, and yet they're not able to express themselves openly. That is also extremely harmful. And that's why I think spaces like your psychedelic cafe, I think you called it, are really, really important. And it's actually the basis I run some spiritual awakening sharing circles as well in London in person. And that was the basis through which that was birthed, because I found there was a real need for people to have a safe, non-judgmental space where they could talk about these experiences openly, whether they were negative or positive, and just be more content and more at peace through the knowing that they could speak about them openly.
I'm holding three things. I like you're sort of like this is the fourth thing, the way that you're making like a call for a kind of change in how we're able to understand and how clinicians are showing up to these experiences. And it's just like, I feel it, and it's beautiful. And thank you for making that call and for doing your work to continue to sort of like not only make the call, but give some substance to hand out at the same time. Be like, we got to do this. And like, here's a bunch of data to help us. But then the three things, one of which is just like totally ridiculous. I was thinking about the word taboo and to taboo a thing. And then I thought about when we taboo and it's like, oh, you tabooed, that it was like a taboo-boo. Oh, taboo-boo.
We don't have that in England. It's a Canadian thing.
It just came into my head right now. I don't know if it's real.
Love that.
This is the beginning. Somebody listening, please put that on Urban Dictionary. Yeah, but
is it a rude word? It's not a rude word, is it?
Taboo-boo?
Yeah, no, it's a cute one.
Yeah, taboo, and then like, I have a boo-boo, like a little, like a kid, like, I have a boo-boo. Anyways, so yeah, what were the two other ones? One of which is like listening to your call. It's like your call for this sort of like shift. I realized just like how immense of a challenge that is, given the actual structure of the very the fields of study that would need to integrate this. How does a field of study almost entirely rooted on biological psychiatry to assess what are a person's symptoms, how do I associate it with a brain issue, a brain deficiency, and what medications do I give them to fix the brain problem so their symptoms go away? Like, that's predominantly, from what I understand, sort of like clinical psychiatry, at least in Canada. That's sort of the baseline, right? That's not, I think, up to date with what the actual science says, but clinical practice in the public generally, I imagine, is pretty far behind from what the most cutting edge science is. The challenge of that, and the challenge of, as a larger cultural institution, like I recently interviewed Martijn Scherp from Synthesis Institute in the Netherlands. And there was a part of the conversation where we talked about the difference between integrating psychedelics into mainstream institutions and psychedelicizing those institutions so that psychedelics fit inside of them. And that being a very important difference. And just sort of recognizing the scope of the challenge and the scope of the conversation if we were to start to dive into what's happening with the structure now and why is it such a challenge, and just kind of like leaving that as an open wondering for people listening. And then the other thing that came up was you talking about, can't remember exactly, but it was in talking about the psychopathologizing. And I thought of a few things. I thought about something in Anna Lekitis' book about monophasic and polyphasic sort of cultures, where some cultures, just like ours, monophasic. There's like, reality is your baseline waking state and everything else is a deviation. It's baseline. Where polyphasic is like, yeah, that's one of them, but then there's also the spiritual absorption is a totally other state of consciousness, and that's just as valid as this one, right? And that links to Darshan Narvaez and Four Arrows. They just recently put out a book called the Restoring the Kinship Worldview, and talking about the comparison between sort of like the dominant worldview and the indigenous worldview and how they're different. And they use a poly something word and a univocal something to describe a similar premise. And then that brought me to, I think it's Ian McGilchrist in his work. What is it? The Master and Apprentice?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And how much we've shut down this sort of like right side thinking, this absorption, this whole other way of being in order to overly prioritize this sort of like extract, compartmentalize, differentiate, like that sort of part of our mind, which is like culturally apexed. That's not really, if that's the baseline, then there's no spiritual experience that is ever going to be seen as valid if institutions are holding that is the only true and healthy and correct way to experience reality, right? Yeah. So those were the three things that came up.
So interesting. Yeah. And it is true. And actually one of the defining features of these experiences is that people finally are sort of, not finally, but they're sort of more open or understanding of multiple levels of consciousness or ways of experiencing life. In terms of things changing, I think things are changing, actually, thankfully, slowly but surely. People have been trying to change the way that modern psychiatry and psychology works for quite a while now. But I think that the information has often been compartmentalized. So whoever reads those kinds of papers are already interested in things like transpersonal psychology. And so the information doesn't tend to sort of trickle down or out into the world. But I think what's happening now, especially thanks to psychedelic research, is that we're starting to understand that these experiences might not only be subjectively beneficial, but also objectively beneficial to human beings. The more we can investigate those neurobiological underpinnings and the psychological sort of preceding states for those experiences, and also their outcomes, their objective outcomes as well as their subjective outcomes, we'll be able to make a case for why these experiences should be more better investigated, and why things need to change in Western psychiatry and psychology. And just to add on that point as well, I feel like the way that we have been going in modern Western psychology and psychiatry and medicine, we're sort of undermining other cultures as well. If our Western interpretation, which is the dominant interpretation in the world, overshadows cultural interpretations, indigenous interpretations, Eastern interpretations of these kinds of experiences, then we are, by our very nature, being racist or undermining at least other cultures and other cultural interpretations. And so I think it's really important that we go back to the roots and find a common consensus. And perhaps we don't even need to find that common consensus. It's about how we treat people who are having these experiences. And yeah.
I'm going to go back. You were saying something about like shifting psychiatry, and I want to talk about connectedness. I'm putting a pin in that. But something that you said there about it being kind of racist, this is also something I talked about with Anna Lekitis, but I use the term colonial, which is very much like, and actually it comes up when I think about a lot of people who are atheists. is this sort of like, we, the Western dominant mind, like, yeah, of course, we respect that all these different cultures have different ways of being and so on and so forth. And we're investigating them so that we can get beneath the fantasy of their culture and get to the truth that we can discover through what is objective, which is science. And so when we discover that there's a common thread, or it's like this and it's like this, what we're discovering is the Western absolute truth that was buried underneath all their frilly cultural stuff. And like, I don't think we recognize how much we're doing that. Now, not that there's a lot of nuance to that discussion, but I see what you're saying in that sense. And I think that that's important to hold, that as much as we've accomplished a lot, and I think science really discovers a lot, and my housemate uses this phrase, and I think it's great, which is like, you got to hang your hat somewhere, and so for myself, I definitely hang it somewhere, but different people might hang their hats in different places, and that they might not appear to be the same. And it's not that one is a fraction of the other, or like has some of the other, where it's actually much more complex than that. And that's a hard kind of complexity to manage in a culture of people who are very overemphasizing the apprentice.
I think science is a wonderful tool. And in fact, my awakening actually pushed me towards science, and it got me a lot more interested in science. I think science is wonderful. So I think it's also important for us to bridge the worlds of science and spirituality. I'm not against science in any way. In fact, I'm pro it. It's more this scientism that you see emerging and dominating, particularly Western culture, whereby people who work in the sciences are typically, and again, by no means I want to generalize everyone, but materialists by default, and thus less likely to even consider the existence of these experiences as a potential other way of experiencing life. But like you said, it tends to be more this idea of looking at another cultural interpretation or individual's interpretation of the experience and just denying it purely because it doesn't fit within our current scientific understanding. And I think that's wrong, because obviously we have an infinite amount to uncover in science, and so we need to be open to all sorts of human experiences, and to get to the bottom of the neuroscience and psychology of these experiences, or the triggers of these experiences, is not to deny their subjective interpretations or the experience of them. Why do we feel so connected to something greater than ourselves? Why do we feel this? Why do we experience this love that we perhaps haven't felt before? So you can get to the bottom, perhaps in the future, in maybe a few hundred years, you might be able to understand the role that each, little brain working might have on the psyche. But that's not to explain why the experience is so profound and life-changing for people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't explain like, oh, okay, so this part of the brain fired, so that's why it felt meaningful.
Yeah.
Or like, you had an overactive locus ceruleus. That's where your spiritual experience came from.
Yeah.
Solved.
And it is super interesting, but it is super, super interesting. And it's something that I want to, do in more depth. I want to investigate the sort of neural underpinnings of these experiences. But again, that's not to say that we'll ever understand the meaning of life, because essentially that's what the revelation is. It's understanding something more. It's all about self-realization and the meaning of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what's coming up for me is just like a question of like, by what worldview, like what deeply foundational inner context with which, through which, and by which do we interpret the world and engage the world, and and from which, through which, and by which we utilize various tools for engaging the world, science being one of those tools. And that it's sort of like something about that deep reflection of like, at the very foundation of how I understand what is is a worldview that isn't necessarily what is most fundamentally and absolutely correct. And I think that that is something that is generally lost on the Western, in sort of like the Western, in the colonial mindset, which I don't know, it's such a complex topic, and I notice myself fumbling and like conscientious that I might accidentally be making propositions that don't hold a lot of weight if they're taken down into nuances. And I hold that all as being true, while also like this is what's coming up as we're talking about the topic.
I feel the same way, by the way. And I think it's just important to not take the words literally, but to sort of try and understand that it's really hard to put these kind of really complex social problems into words. And yeah.
Yeah, and here we are, like we're wondering about it. We're bringing an inquiry to it. We have some stances, but it's also just you and I in the conversation right now. Other stances might shift and bring different inquiry, and different kinds of understanding might emerge as a consequence. And hopefully that's the experience people listening are having. It's like, here's an inquiry, not like their interpretations at this time are the correct ones, but like we were bringing an inquiry to a thing. What if I bring an inquiry to this thing? How do I feel about that?
Nobody's claiming to have answers.
So I just want to go back to something you were saying about coming into a therapist office or psychiatry, or understanding the brain mechanisms and getting this data to the people. One thing that I've been holding a lot, and it comes from my own journey, conversations, research, and a couple key figures, is this sort of like the role of our sense of connectedness in our sort of like health and well-being. And I actually did a cafe explicitly about our sense of connectedness. Actually, Rosalind Watts was, who I assume you would know. She was actually invited, couldn't come because her like what is it called? The ACE integration launch was like 5 days later or something. She's like, but we had a great series of guests. And I'm just thinking about these spontaneous spiritual experiences, and like what is happening there. Like maybe one interpretive lens is there's this sense that like a foundational part of one's worldview and one's sense of self within the world is now shifted from being an individual to being nested inside of a larger web of connection, which is beauty and love and these other things. And wondering, like, if we're psychedelicizing institutions, then what is it that helps garner, both protect and garner that sense of connectedness, after the experience and even in our lives as a whole, because you have a spontaneous, beautiful, incredible experience, and then you go back into an environment where that sense of connectedness is absent from all your interactions with others as a consequence of that being the default of most of our cultural engagement. And that's just another wondering that's coming up around this sense of connection.
Well, yeah, and another thing that comes up for people is how do I integrate this into my work life, and because often something that I didn't mention in terms of the changes is that often people report this heightened sense of mission, or of selfless service, of needing to be of service towards other people. And actually, I'm mentioning this now because it came up a lot last night during the sharing circle that I was facilitating, where people had this really profound experience, and then they didn't really know kind of what to do with it. I mean, not that anybody needs to do anything with it at all, but there seems to be this recurring thing of needing to not only make sense, but do good onto the world. And yeah, that just what you said, that's one of my sort of interjections and wonderings. But it's an interesting one. There's lots of stuff that comes up.
So I'm curious what your read is on that, being someone facilitating support circles. I don't know if you're sort of like the central person that's helping give advice, or you're just holding a space for sort of a more collaborative, I mean, it could be collaborative with you in the lead as well, but like a sort of like a horizontal sharing of listening and advice giving and perspective. But I'm curious what your read is on that, because I definitely know people, in my life who have had these profound experiences and now deeply struggle with what it is that they'll do in their lives, right? Or it's an ongoing inquiry for them, especially in a context of anyone kind of paying attention right now recognizes that, we'll say, like 99% of what you can do as a job right now is actually causing more harm than good, right? Even if you're doing good in one way, well, you might be working in an industry that's doing harm somewhere else, which makes it even more difficult to find it out. So I'm just curious what your read is on that challenge.
I don't tend to give advice, because I think even just by speaking with people openly about your experience and what you're going through, that can help you gain the insight that you need on your own journey. I think that often there's this sort of like, people tend to, I don't want to be seen as anything other than part of the group. And that's why I don't give advice. So we get that kind of, people tend to fall into the sort of guru complex a lot in these kinds of circles. And I'm very aware not to fall into that trap. Also, there's no need, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's just a sharing circle, but it's not a cult or anything like that. But I really tend to stay away from that. And then obviously we all share advice afterwards. We always tend to have a more informal discussion and share advice. But so it's something that I've considered. It's not necessarily any sort of advice that I give to the people who ask me, but I don't know. It's a difficult one, because it really depends on your socioeconomic context as well. For instance, luckily enough, in my own experience, I was able to quit my job and then pursue a new kind of career in psychology by going back to uni, gaining the tools that I needed in order to be able to talk about these experiences through a more scientific lens or academic lens. But for some people, that's not an option, and they have families or they don't have enough money to be able to do that. And so it's kind of difficult. Again, there's no sort of one size fits all answer to this. I would say that if people have the means to then pursue the career that they want, then they should throw themselves at it. But if not, then just to build the little steps towards what it is they want to do. But I think that your question goes beyond that, because it's usually for people who don't really know what to do after the experience, or who feel a little bit lost in this environment. I don't actually know. Yeah, it's a really tricky one, actually.
We're in the mystery now. We made it. Yeah, of course. It's. I would be surprised if you had a one size fits all answer there, and I think also it's valuable for listeners to hear, like, yeah, like other people go through this, and yeah, it's not easy, and in some sense, like, I don't think idiosyncratic is the right word here, but like it has to be unique and different for each person, because each person, is a different expression of life on this planet with different contexts, internally and externally, and in order to find and I think this is how I'm characterizing it. It's like, yeah, I was living a life that mostly made sense with what I understood to be reality. And now reality is totally different. And there's this call to realizing, like, oh, reality is different. And there's a different role that I am inside in this. And I want to be a part of this role. And now my external reality and my sort of the systems by which I'm engaging the world on the various levels of my personhood, identity, behavior, relational conduct, vocation, occupation, maybe not the same thing, all of these things, they're no longer congruent with this change in the worldview. And like trying to like make the shifts in oneself and how we're showing up and where and in what ways we're showing up to the world in order to create that congruency is extremely difficult, especially in a context where very much so the world that we're in is based. It is built from the ground up. It's actually built from the decimated ground up, on a contrary worldview, right? Contrary to what the spontaneous spiritual awakening tends to elicit. So, and that's, again, back to Stephen Jenkinson, maybe the challenge of that is the spiritual work of our times, of our generation, and it isn't necessarily to get it right, but to start leaning at least in the direction that a subsequent generation could pick it up from there.
And in fact, spiritual crises, what we mentioned earlier, spiritual emergencies, they often actually arise in the integration process for these very reasons, actually. So people find themselves with a completely new sense of self and identity and in relation to themselves and the world around them. And they don't really know how to deal with that. And it can be quite a struggle. And I think that's why holding safe spaces for people to just be upfront and honest about their experience in the positive and the negative can be really helpful to help them understand that they're not alone, that other people struggle with this, and perhaps to find an answer within a community, and through conversation and through reading, different bits of literature and engaging in different maybe spiritual contemplative practices or being out in nature. So taking on board what was learnt during the experience and sort of going one step at a time to then find a new way of living and existing in this world. But it is definitely possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even just bringing my own shift to the language there, like taking what was experienced in that experience and then learning. The learning comes afterwards. Right? Like we've got a lesson in what's up with the world, and now the learning is like, how do I live my life after? And that's not easy learning, but chances are when our end of days comes for each of us eventually, having efforted to do the learning is going to be, like on the tally, when we get there. And also a number of the things you spoke to is like what it looks like afterwards all just look like connection, like being able to just speak to what's happening and have someone hear you in its positive and challenges. Well, what's happening in that moment? You're being seen. What's happening when you're being seen? You're with an other. What's happening when you're with an other? You're connected. And like being in, even like there's a conceptual thing, but if you're reading books and whatever and you're getting insight, you're now actually connecting not only with a person, but an entire system of thought that sort of supports your sense of connection to like, oh, I'm not alone in these ideas. And there's all this stuff that all comes down to coming back into a prevailing sense of connection in the challenge and the learning, and possibly in the challenge and the learning of being human, which is, usually not very easily, not very easy.
Yeah. Totally. But even with reading, I mean, I remember when I was undergoing my experience and I was in the integration phase, and I kind of thought to myself, even though I felt like I didn't really need the validation because I was so certain of what had just happened to me, but I felt the need to connect with others and to, I thought to myself, I knew intuitively that I wasn't the only one to have had this experience, but I didn't know where to look. And I picked up a book by Alan Watts, my first Alan Watts book, my first spiritual piece of literature. And it's called The Book, Against the Taboo of Knowing Who You Really Are, something like that. And I related so much to Alan Watts in that book. And that in itself just shifted the direction that I was heading in. Not that it was a negative direction, but it was another branch of experience of like, whoa, I'm not only being seen, I can relate, I understand, feel like he understands me even though he doesn't know who I am and he's dead. But right. There was this wonderful...
Maybe he does know who you are.
I wish. He's my crush. I mean, he's dead. He's my crush. Just kidding. But it was such an incredible... So even, spiritual literature can be really helpful to just make sense and feel connected to other human beings who have had really powerful spiritual experiences.
So I think in listening, people who have gone through this experience have probably gotten a lot of good sort of perspective. Good as in like valuable, like generative perspective on sort of how to navigate what they're going through in some sense, or at least maybe some sense that they're not alone or sense making is possible. And I'm curious, especially given that we've talked so much about how the cultural context is such that many of the challenges coming out of a spontaneous spiritual awakening come from that person who had the awakening coming up against worldviews and conduct and misunderstanding that negatively impacts their own integration process. And I'm wondering if, out of your time working with people and hearing from people, if you've gleaned, or like doing the research, if you've gleaned any pieces of advice or suggestions that you would offer to the person who didn't have the experience, who is hearing the story of the person who did and wants to be supportive. Any pieces there?
Yeah, I would say that it's really important in that role to adopt a non-judgmental behavior. So you may have your own projections of the experience or understanding of the experience, but I think what's really helpful to those who are undergoing the experience, if you want to be supportive, is to just listen and to not offer too much of your own, I don't want to say don't offer advice, but within reason, as in be aware of their own interpretation of the experience. And if there's anything practical that you think you could offer in terms of advice, then that's brilliant. But I think, if someone says that they've encountered God, or they've felt this beautiful sense of love or connection with other people and or with the universe, I think just, even if you don't understand it, just keep an open mind. It's something that happens to more people than we think. And we don't really know what the cause of it is or the reasons for it is. But yeah, just to keep an open mind and keep a non-judgmental approach towards the person who's sharing this very important experience with you. That's the first thing that I would say.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And if you don't mind me jumping in, there's something there about, like, I don't know if you've come up, I imagine the listeners have come up on this framing of like the two different ways of listening. There's like listening to be seen, like listening to offer that person the experience of being seen. And then there's problem solving. And when you're giving one kind of listening or responsiveness, when the other is the appropriate one, then it ends up being hurtful. If someone's just like opening up to their experience about whatever, and you're trying to problem solve their distress, that's actually going to leave them more distressed. There's something about helping that person just feel seen. And I think in that there's also, obviously, we'll have judgments, and that's okay, as long as those judgments don't inform your perception of that person in a way that informs your conduct, that takes you out of the ability to be in a supportive role.
Exactly.
Right?
Well said.
There's judgment, there's non-judgment, then there's post-judgment, which recognizes some places I'm not judgmental, some places I am, and I'll just hold all of that with a kind of mindset that still respects that there's more happening here than my perceptions of this thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Really well put. And just some advice. I mean, I don't know if you were going to come on to this, but some advice if you are going through the experience. If you feel that you need to connect with a mental health professional who perhaps has even undergone something similar to you, because there are many people within these roles who have had spiritual experiences and even awakening experiences to some degree or another, then I will send the links to James, or maybe he'll put them in the comments below, or in the description box, of a couple of resources or websites that you can consult if you need to get in touch with a mental health professional who specializes in these kinds of experiences. And they're very much still a part of modern Western psychology and psychiatry, and they may even refer you to somebody else afterwards. But I think as a first call of action, they are definitely the people to speak to. And also join peer support groups and sharing circles. And as we've already mentioned, read spiritual literature, and you'll feel less alone, definitely, in your experience. But there's a lot of really good stuff mushrooming on the internet now.
Mm-hmm. That's great. I'll make sure those links are contained in the show notes of this episode, which is always at jameswjesso.com. And I would also refer people to listen to the Psychedelic Cafe I mentioned a couple of times about what it means to have a spiritual crisis, because we go quite deep into that. And there's, I think, six minds on the subject who all have experience. And also each of those people, I think at least half of them are people you could reach out to and say, hey, like, can I hire your services or something? And also in this moment, I'm going to do a little fancy editing to move this, what I'm about to say, to before you gave the links, because there's one question that I forgot to ask, which I think is actually quite important. And it goes back to that supportive role, which is, as somebody witnessing or supporting another person in their spontaneous spiritual awakening, what would you say, like, what's the question? Advice, maybe, perspective, what to look for? At what point does the supportive person, does it make sense for them to seriously consider trying to get some sort of psychiatric intervention? Like, what would you suggest they look for? And at what point does it make sense to bring in a medical professional?
I would say once the situation seems to fall outside of once the experience starts to become a little bit more negative, or it seems like to be heading towards a depressive state, or people suggest harming themselves, or any of the kind of obvious negative symptoms that might arise from certain extreme psychological states, and obviously do consult a mental health professional. And I would say that one can even do that in the more positive kind of experience, but evidently, perhaps going through a transpersonal psychologist before reaching a psychiatrist, just to get a different perspective on the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I would add to that, because you said about positive, is if it appears as though that person isn't sleeping, or is getting increasingly erratic, or starts making really extreme life changes, like spontaneously being like, I'm going to sell my house and my car, my everything, and move away. It's been like, a week, they look distressed. Because I think there's something important to sort of differentiate between, like, having a spontaneous spiritual awakening and making sense of it, and having a spontaneous spiritual awakening and entering a kind of mania that can negatively impact, is actually a self-harm, even though it is experienced as positive by the person, or if any sort of signs of paranoia, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for bringing them into the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's because I had an interview with Shane Moss called The Psychedelic Trip to the Psych Ward. He was making a documentary about how psychedelics are good for you, and ends up having a psychotic episode and needing to be hospitalized for 2 weeks because he stopped sleeping and was getting super paranoid. And his insights all made sense. I was like, that just sounds like spiritual insights. And yet his relationship to it was very harmful, and he needed that medical intervention, which maybe will be another interview that I'll cross-link for listeners to check out. Maybe you'd find it interesting as well. Yeah. So from a purely interest standpoint, how would, two things: one, what's next for you in your research? And two, how can people stay up to date with your research / support you in your research?
Thank you. So next on my list of many ideas and research projects that I want to embark on, I'm going to be working with a psychologist called Steve Taylor, who is just fantastic in my opinion. And we're going to be looking at cases of release from addiction post-spiritual awakening experiences, because this is something that came up a lot, both in my own research and in his research. He's been doing this kind of research for a while now, whereby we've spoken to people who disclose that they were addicted to substances like alcohol, tobacco, but even stronger drugs before their experience, and then by fluke after their experience were released from that addiction. So we were really interested to investigate that in more depth. So that's next on the list. And then I've got another project with the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, who Anna is a part of, looking at the overlaps and interlinks between mental health disorders and these kinds of experiences, not only limited to awakenings, but just spiritually transformative experiences in general. So those are the two new projects that I'll be working on. And then opinion pieces on why I think we need to bring these topics to, primary, secondary, and further education as well. So yeah, that's what I'll be doing shortly.
And where can people the EPRC? I just remember hearing that as I'm preparing the links from Anna's podcast, which I'm going to be working on shortly after this call. Where can people follow your work? Do you share on Twitter? Do you just have like a ResearchGate or Facebook or a newsletter, anything like that? Can people follow you on social?
I have Facebook, but it's quite a sort of personal means, I guess. The thing is, I need to create a website. I'm not very good for things like this, but you can find on Google Scholar, Jessica Corneille. You'll have my name, I think, underneath, so you can just copy paste that into Google Scholar, and then an academia page, and I believe I have ResearchGate as well. But you can always contact me on my email address, which is my first and surname, so Jessica Corneille @gmail.com. And that's perhaps the best way if you want to keep in touch, take part in any future studies, whether they may be pertinent to the two studies that I said I'll be working on, or any other studies in the future. I can put you on a database if you've had an awakening type experience. And if you want to be in touch, that's probably the best means, I would say. So
Great.
Feel free to tell me.
I'll make sure those links, all that data is in the show notes of this episode. Well, also, if between now and when the episode actually releases, you launch anything else, Twitter, website, etc., I will include those things as well, so people can jump over if you happen to be on their preferred platform by that time. Okay, now, boom. Okay, we're back to after your links were all shared. So, Jessica, it's Corneille.
Yes.
Okay, Jessica Corneille, thank you so much for coming on Adventures to the Mind. I had a really wonderful conversation with you. Your work seems to be something that is incredibly valuable and will have, fingers crossed for us both, a really positive impact on the field of clinical and research understanding of this phenomenon, and for the betterment of all peoples, hopefully. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. It was a real pleasure to chat with you, and thank you.
And cut. Okay, thank you so much for tuning in to this interview of Adventures Through the Mind. If you liked what you heard there from Jessica, please head to the links in the description to the show notes in this episode. I've included where you could get more about her work, and also there are a number of links that she put out for various resources for people undergoing spiritual transformation experiences, crises, etc. And I put those all in the show notes as well if you'd like to follow up with any of those links for your personal curiosity, your personal need, or for the supportive role you might be playing for somebody else in your life. And other than that, that was this episode of Adventures Through the Mind, episode 171. If you found value in it, please do share it. If you're watching this on YouTube, please do subscribe. I'm putting clips out to the main channel now, so there might be some clips of sections that you think are interesting that you could send out into your social media sphere. Not everybody wants to watch a 2-hour podcast, turns out. And yeah, that would be all be very supportive ways of supporting the show, or supportive ways of supporting. That'd be great. Otherwise, you could support financially through Patreon or PayPal. And links to do so are in the description of this episode, wherever you're checking it out. And that's all for this one. Until the next episode, take care.